There are certain stories that legitimately just seem too strange to be true, and today's story is definitely one of those. Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town. She suddenly came to a stop, and so one of these villagers who were nearby looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped. Sumitra told herself that whatever happened, it had to be a one-time thing, but a few weeks later, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. She would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed, and then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra would fall into another trance, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her, and as her friend cheerfully began walking closer, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped, and she put her hands down by her side, and she went back to this rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked, and then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers came running outside, and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He checked her pulse, he checked her heartbeat, he stepped back, and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. In this village at this time, it was very important for both religious and public health reasons to take care of the body very quickly. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. They all knew about Sumitra's trances, but what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here. And at some point, one of the women was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. Everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked, even though for the past 45 minutes she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. The medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, "I'm okay." And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, "You all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead." Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy, and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. She backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, "She's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover." And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. The next next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man, who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. When Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You're not my family, this is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku. But when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school and so did not know how to write. But now, suddenly, in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come, please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra died, she likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband turned around, he walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, "There's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you." She turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear, and Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong. And so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband, and apparently it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face, and she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond, and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. He lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused, and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry, and then she looked at Ram Tripathi, and she said, "I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home, 60 miles away, was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares, screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station, and when they got there, Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. Until Sumitra appeared to die and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. He decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him and then whispered something into his ear, what Sumitra was saying was, "Papa." In the moment, Ram Tripathi felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Dwivedi. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her 2 sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case, and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.